The world broke in a spray of shattered glass and splintered wood. One moment, Silas Stone was standing in the quiet hum of the Cedar Creek bank, the cool silver of a locket warming in his palm. The next, he was on the floor, the report of a cult peacemaker ringing in his ears. A woman screamed a sound, swallowed by the deeper roar of a second gunshot. Dust and the acrid smell of burnt powder filled the air. Silas hit the floor, the rough-hewn planks digging into his cheek. Instinct honed on battlefields a lifetime ago took over. He made his body small, a mountain trying to become a molehill, and his hand closed instinctively around the locket, his only tangible link to the woman who had been his world. Through the chaos of shouting men and panicked whimpers, a voice cut through the noise, sharp and cold as a winter razor. "Control the doors. No one leaves. The rest of you on your bellies, hands behind your heads." Now, the voice belonged to a man who moved with an unnerving grace amidst the pandemonium. He was dressed in a fine black coat, unbuttoned to reveal a pearl-handled revolver tucked into a leather holster. His face was all sharp angles and cruel amusement, his beard trimmed with a dandy's precision. He scanned the room, his eyes missing nothing, and they settled on Silas, the giant of a man, who even on the floor seemed to take up too much space. "Well now," the man said, his boots clicking on the floor as he approached. "What have we here? A genuine titan." He stopped directly over Silas, the barrel of his revolver glinting in the dusty shafts of sunlight pouring through the shattered window. "Empty your pockets, friend. Let's not make this unpleasant." Silas's mind raced. He had $2 and a half-eaten apple. Nothing worth dying for. But the locket. The locket was different. It held the only surviving photograph of Sarah, her smile captured in silver and glass, a ghost of a memory that kept the cold from settling too deep into his bones. He slowly pulled out the coins, the apple, and laid them on the floor. His other hand remained clenched. The man's smile was thin and bloodless. "All of your pockets, giant. I am not a patient man." He nudged Silas's ribs with the toe of his boot, a gesture of casual dominance. Reluctantly, Silas opened his hand. The locket lay on his calloused palm, its intricate floral engravings a stark contrast to the scars and grime of his skin. The man in black reached down and plucked it from his grasp, his movements delicate, almost surgical. He flicked it open with his thumb. "Sarah." He read the inscription aloud, his tone laced with mock sentimentality. "A pretty name. Was she your wife?" Silas didn't answer. His jaw was a knot of granite. The violation felt deeper than any physical blow. "A man of your stature should understand that possessions are fleeting," the man mused, snapping the locket shut. He slipped it into his own vest pocket. "Especially those tied to a past you so clearly failed to protect." The words were a surgeon's scalpel expertly wielded to find the deepest wound. It was then, in that moment of profound loss and impotent rage, that Silas saw her. Huddled beneath the teller's counter, a small girl no older than 7 was trying to make herself invisible. Her dark hair was a wild tangle around a face pale with terror, and her gray eyes, wide and unblinking, were fixed on the unfolding horror. She wasn't crying. She was frozen, a statue of fear carved from living flesh. In her eyes, Silas saw a reflection of the same bottomless dread that had haunted his own dreams for years. An unspoken connection, a shared understanding of a world broken by violence, passed between them in that fleeting glance. The bank manager, a portly man named Henderson, was being forced to open the vault. The robbers worked with brutal efficiency, stuffing canvas bags with currency and coin. The man in black orchestrated the chaos with calm authority, his voice never rising, yet always obeyed. He was, Silas realized with a soldier's certainty, a commander. The robbery was over in less than 10 minutes. "A pleasure doing business with you, Cedar Creek," the leader called out as his men backed toward the door. His eyes found Silas one last time. "Don't take it personally, giant. It's just business. As they burst out into the street, gunfire erupted again, sharp and panicked. Sheriff Garrett, a decent man with tired eyes, had arrived. The ensuing shootout was brief and one-sided. The outlaws were professionals, in their covering fire disciplined and deadly. When the dust settled, they were gone, leaving behind a shattered bank, 2 dead townsfolk, and a silence more terrifying than the noise it replaced. Silas pushed himself to his feet, his massive frame unfolding like a collapsing building in reverse. The empty space in his pocket felt like a physical wound. But his attention was drawn back to the teller's counter. The little girl was still there, unmoving. He approached slowly, careful not to frighten her further. He knelt, a difficult and creaking process, bringing his scarred face down to her level. "It's over, little one," he said, his voice a low rumble. "They're gone." She didn't respond. Her gaze was fixed on something beyond him, out in the street. Following her line of sight, Silas saw the bodies being covered with blankets. One of them, a man with the gentle face of a scholar, had fallen near a woman in a simple blue dress. The girl's parents. The realization hit Silas with the force of a physical blow. The outlaws hadn't just stolen his past, they had stolen this child's future. He reached out a hand, large and calloused, stopping inches from her shoulder. "My name is Silas," he said softly. "What's yours?" The girl only stared, her gray eyes like storm clouds that had seen too much. The world had stolen her parents, and in its cruelty, it had stolen her voice as well. In the wreckage of the Cedar Creek Bank, amidst the grief and the loss, 2 broken souls found each other in a silence that spoke louder than any words. The giant who had lost his reason to live, and the child who had lost everyone she had ever loved. The days that followed the robbery bled into one another, a haze of grief and quiet routine. The town of Cedar Creek buried its dead, patched its windows, and tried to find its footing on a ground that now felt unsteady. Sheriff Garrett sent telegrams and posted notices, but the outlaws, led by the man the townsfolk now called Vincent Blackwood, had vanished as if swallowed by the vast, indifferent desert. Fern, the silent orphan of the tragedy, became the town's shared responsibility, a living symbol of their collective wound. But shared responsibility often meant no one's responsibility at all. The preacher's wife offered pity. The mayor's wife offered charity, but no one offered a home. Silas, a man who had made a career of avoiding attachments, found himself unable to walk away. He saw the ghosts of his own failures in her haunted eyes. He had failed to protect his wife from the fever that took her, failed to protect his younger brother from the orders that led him to his death at Gettysburg. Now a deep, unfamiliar instinct compelled him not to fail this child. He rented a small 2-room cabin at the edge of town, a simple structure of rough-hewn pine and river stone, and quietly informed the sheriff that Fern would be staying with him. The whispers started immediately. A giant of a man with shadows in his eyes and scars on his hands was no fit guardian for a traumatized girl. But Silas had weathered worse storms than small-town gossip. Their life fell into a rhythm dictated by necessity and unspoken needs. Silas learned to cook meals that were more than just sustenance, to braid hair, with fingers built for hauling timber, to sit in comfortable silence for hours on end. Fern, in turn, communicated through a language of small gestures. A nod for yes, a slight shake of the head for no, a finger pointed at a picture in a book. She never strayed far from his side, a small shadow in the wake of his enormous presence. He learned her history in fragments pieced together from the objects she'd had with her. A book of geological surveys belonging to her father, Thomas Morrison. A worn photograph of a smiling man who looked nothing like the body Silas had seen on the street. She had been visiting her aunt and uncle in Cedar Creek, a brief stop on a longer journey. Now she was an island, her entire world swept away by a tide of violence. Silas found a measure of peace in the simple domesticity. Mending a fence, splitting firewood, preparing a meal, these tasks had a clear purpose, a tangible result that stood in stark contrast to the moral ambiguity of war. He was building something again, not a barn or a homestead, but a fragile sanctuary for two. He began to notice the world through her eyes, the way the morning sun painted the canyon walls in shades of amber, and rose the intricate patterns of a spider's web, the taste of wild berries picked from a bush by the creek. He also began to confront the ghosts he had carried for so long. At night, when Fern was asleep, he would sit on the porch staring at the empty space in his vest pocket where Sarah's locket used to be. The loss of it was a constant dull ache. Blackwood hadn't just stolen a piece of silver. He had stolen the key to Silas's most sacred memories. Sometimes a loud noise, a backfiring wagon, a slamming door would send a tremor through his hands, and he would be back on the battlefield, the scent of blood and fear thick in his throat. But then he would hear the soft sound of Fern's breathing from the other room, and the ghosts would recede, held at bay by the quiet presence of his new charge. He was showing, not telling himself, that he could be a protector again. One evening he sat by the fire, whittling a piece of scrap pine. His large hands, surprisingly deft, coaxed the shape of a horse from the wood. Fern watched from her chair, her fascination a silent, palpable thing. When he was finished, he sanded it smooth and held it out to her. It was a simple carving, but the horse's mane flowed back as if caught in a gallop, its form a study in freedom and motion. Her eyes widened. She reached for it with a reverence that touched him deeply, her small fingers tracing the lines he had carved. "Every little girl should have a horse of her own," Silas said, his voice softer than he intended. "Even if it's just a wooden one." She looked up at him, and for the first time since the robbery, a flicker of something other than fear or sorrow crossed her face. It was a fragile seed of trust. She held the horse to her chest, a silent promise between them. Their fragile peace was shattered 2 weeks later. Two strangers rode into town, men whose fine clothes and polished boots were as out of place as a diamond in a dust storm. They checked into the hotel and began asking questions, their inquiries pointed and specific. They were looking for a girl who matched Fern's description. Sheriff Garrett found Silas splitting wood behind his cabin. The lawman's face, usually a mask of weary resolve, was etched with concern. "Silas, we need to talk," Garrett said, his voice low. "Those men at the hotel, they're asking about Fern." Silas buried the axe in the chopping block, his movements deliberate. "What about her?" "They say she's not who we think she is. They're calling her Isabella Carmichael, the missing heiress to a wealthy Philadelphia family. They say she was kidnapped months ago." Garrett shifted uncomfortably. "They have papers, Silas. Legal documents. And they're offering a substantial reward for her safe return." The words were a cold fist in Silas's gut. Carmichael. The name meant nothing. The story felt wrong, a puzzle piece from a different box entirely. "Her name is Fern Morrison," Silas stated, his voice flat. "Her father was Thomas Morrison. He died in the bank robbery." "I know what you believe," Garrett said, his weariness deepening. "But these men have a compelling story. And the law. Well, the law tends to favor folks with money and official-looking papers." He sighed, the sound of a man caught between his duty and his conscience. "The man in charge, he's a smooth talker. Calls himself a family representative. But I've seen his type before. He's a hunter." That evening, Silas watched Fern as she slept, the carved wooden horse clutched in her hand. The stranger's story didn't fit. The terror in Fern's eyes during the robbery hadn't been the fear of a kidnapped victim seeing potential rescuers. It had been the fear of a witness. He knew with a certainty that settled deep in his bones that these men were not here to save her. They were here to reclaim her. And he suspected they were connected to the man who had stolen his past, the man called Blackwood. The fight for Sarah's locket had just become a fight for Fern's life. The next morning, Silas decided to face the hunters directly. He found them in the hotel dining room, their expensive suits a stark anomaly against the rustic backdrop. The leader, a man with cold, calculating eyes, introduced himself as Mr. Harlow, a representative of the Carmichael family. His companions were stone-faced men who wore their guns like they knew how to use them. Mr. Stone Harlow began, his voice as smooth as polished marble. "I understand you've taken a charitable interest in Isabella Carmichael. The child I care for is named Fern Morrison." Silas set his voice a low rumble that made the silverware vibrate. "She's not going anywhere." Harlow's smile was a thin, predatory slash. "Sentiment is admirable, Mr. Stone, but it does not supersede the law. We have legal guardianship papers. We are here to take the child home. A child doesn't end up half-drowned in trauma by accident." Silas countered deliberately, omitting the details of the robbery. He was testing them, watching for a reaction. She lost her voice from something terrible. "What aren't you telling me?" Harlow's composure didn't slip, but one of his men shifted a flicker of unease in his eyes. "The kidnapping was a traumatic event," Harlow said smoothly. "The child is confused. That is why she needs to be with her family to receive the proper care." Silas knew he was being fed a well-rehearsed lie. "She seems to think her family died in the bank 2 weeks ago." The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken threats. Harlow's eyes hardened. "Mr. Stone, you are interfering with a legal matter. I advise you to reconsider your position. We will have the girl one way or another." The confrontation solidified Silas's resolve. He spent the afternoon making quiet preparations. He visited the blacksmith, a fellow war veteran named Tom Bradley, and made arrangements for some special work on his rifle. He charted escape routes out of the valley, mentally mapping the canyons and hidden trails he had explored in the preceding months. He was a soldier again, preparing a battlefield. The turning point came that night. A nightmare, raw and terrifying, ripped Fern from her sleep. She woke with a scream that was pure, primal terror. Silas was by her side in an instant, his large hand gently resting on her shoulder. "It's all right, little one. You're safe," he murmured. Shaking, she looked up at him, her eyes wide with the ghosts of her memory. And then, for the first time, she spoke. Her voice was a ragged whisper, fragile as a cobweb. "They weren't robbing the bank," she said, the words tumbling out. "They were there for Papa, for his maps." Silas listened, his blood turning to ice as the true story unfolded in broken, terrified sentences. Her father, Thomas Morrison, was a geologist. He had discovered a massive, incredibly valuable mineral deposit in the nearby mountains, something far more precious than gold. He had arranged a partnership with a wealthy Philadelphia family, the Carmichaels, to finance the mining operation. His maps and legal claims were stored in the vault at the Cedar Creek Bank for safekeeping. Mr. Carmichael. He wanted it all. Fern whispered, her small body trembling. He sent those men. The man in the black coat. He told Papa that partnerships could be dissolved. The bank robbery had been a fiction, a violent cover for a targeted assassination and theft. Vincent Blackwood wasn't a random outlaw. He was an enforcer hired by the Carmichaels. And Fern was the sole witness. She had seen Blackwood murder her father in the bank manager's office before the chaos erupted in the main lobby. Her mother had been killed in the subsequent crossfire. The story was a perfect, horrifying circle. Harlow and his men weren't here to rescue a kidnapped heiress. They were here to silence the only person alive who could connect the powerful Carmichael family to murder. They had invented the story of Isabella Carmichael as legal cover to snatch the witness. "They can't let them find me." Fern sobbed, clutching his arm. "They'll kill me like they killed Papa." "No," Silas said, his voice a raw, unshakable vow. "They will not touch you." He now understood the full scope of the danger. This wasn't just about protecting a child. It was about standing against a powerful, ruthless conspiracy that used murder as a business tactic. The local law, even a good man like Sheriff Garrett, would be powerless against the Carmichaels' wealth and influence. He and Fern were alone. His mind went back to Blackwood's taunt as he stole the locket. A past you so clearly failed to protect. The man hadn't just been cruel. He had been probing, testing. Did he know who Silas was? Did their pasts intersect somewhere in the bloody ledger of the war? The thought sent a chill down his spine. Blackwood wasn't just a hired gun. He was a ghost from Silas's own haunted past, and he had returned to take away the one thing that had given Silas a future. The sun rose on a world that felt fundamentally different. The quiet struggle to protect a child had become a declaration of war. That morning, Silas began to see subtle shifts in the town. Harlow's money had been at work. The stable owner, who had always been friendly, was now distant. The clerk at the general store averted his eyes. Fear and greed were turning the town against him. He knew they couldn't stay. He packed their few belongings into saddlebags, his movements swift and efficient. He left a note for Sheriff Garrett, a simple, unsigned message. The girl is a witness to her father's murder. The men hunting her are the killers. I am keeping her safe. As they prepared to leave under the cover of dusk, he saw Blackwood step out of the saloon. The man in black stood across the street watching the cabin, a cold smile playing on his lips. He knew they were planning to run, and he was letting them. It was a game to him, a hunt. Silas looked at Fern, who stood beside their horse, her face a small, determined mask. She clutched her wooden horse in one hand and held the reins with the other. She was terrified, but she was ready. She trusted him. That trust was a weight heavier than any medal, more binding than any oath. "We'll go through the high canyons," he said softly. "The trails are hard, but they won't expect it." As they mounted up and rode out of Cedar Creek, not into the open desert, but up into the jagged, shadowy maze of the sandstone cliffs, Silas felt a strange sense of clarity. He had spent years running from his past, from the man he had been on the battlefield. Now, to save Fern, he would have to become that man again. The hunter, the survivor, the phantom. And this time, he wasn't fighting for a flag or a cause. He was fighting for a little girl with storm-gray eyes, who had against all odds given him a reason to live. The desert held his past, but the canyons, he prayed, would hold their future. The high country was a brutal, beautiful wilderness. The sun beat down on the valley, turning the red sand into a shimmering, blinding mirror. Dust, fine as powdered bone, coated everything, leaving a gritty taste in the mouth. But up in the canyons, the air was thin and cool, and the world was a labyrinth of stone and shadow. Silas pushed their horses hard, using his knowledge of the terrain to put as much distance as possible between them and Cedar Creek. He knew Blackwood's men would be expert trackers, but this was his ground. He had spent weeks exploring these hidden trails, finding a strange solace in their solitude. Now that solitude was their only ally. They rode for 2 days, speaking little, conserving their energy. Fern was a stoic companion, her small frame swaying with the rhythm of her horse, her eyes constantly scanning the ridgelines. She was a child forged in trauma, and it had left her with a survivor's instincts. On the 3rd day, Silas spotted the dust cloud in the distance. A single rider moving fast. "They found our trail," he said, his voice grim. He led them off the main path into a narrow fissure in the rock, barely wide enough for their horses. They dismounted in a hidden box canyon, a natural fortress of stone. "Stay with the horses. Keep quiet." He scaled the canyon wall with the silent ease of a predator, his rifle slung over his back. From a high ledge, he watched the rider approach. It wasn't Blackwood. It was Sheriff Garrett. The lawman rode into the canyon's entrance and stopped his hand, raised in a sign of peace. "Silas, I know you're in here. I'm alone." Silas watched him for a long, silent minute before revealing himself. Garrett's face was etched with exhaustion and something else, respect. "How did you find us?" Silas asked, his rifle held loosely but ready. "You left tracks a blind man could follow for the first 10 miles, Garrett said with a wry smile. "You wanted me to find you." He dismounted and pulled a canteen from his saddle. "Your note. It made a damn lot of sense. Harlow's been acting less like a family friend and more like a conquering general. He practically owns the mayor now." Garrett looked toward the hidden horses, catching a glimpse of Fern. "I wear this badge to keep the peace, Silas, not to referee old ghosts. But this is different. That girl is a witness, and those men are killers. The law in Cedar Creek may have been bought, but I haven't." He held out a small, heavy pouch. "Ammunition. And some food. It's not much, but it's what I could sneak out." The gesture was a profound statement. Garrett was choosing a side, and in doing so, he was likely signing his own death warrant. "They'll come after you," Silas warned. "Let 'em." Garrett set his tired eyes glinting with a forgotten fire. It's been a while since this badge meant anything more than locking up drunks. Maybe it's time it did. He gave Silas a map. "There's an old mining outpost about 50 miles north. Abandoned. But there's a telegraph line there that's still active. If you can get a message to the territorial marshal in Prescott, you might stand a chance. Tell them everything. The Carmichael name carries weight, but a federal warrant for murder carries more." Before he left, Garrett hesitated. "Silas, there's something else. Blackwood was asking about you. Not just as the man who has the girl. He was asking about your military service. He mentioned Gettysburg." The sheriff's words confirmed Silas's deepest fear. This wasn't a random encounter. It was a reckoning. After Garrett left, the true hunt began. Blackwood and his men were relentless. They were skilled, and they knew the desert. Silas was forced to use every bit of his wartime experience to stay ahead of them. They doubled back on their own tracks, laid false trails, and traveled at night, navigating by the stars. During the day, they would hide resting in the shade of overhanging cliffs while Silas kept watch. In these quiet moments, the bond between Silas and Fern deepened. He taught her how to read the land, how to find water, how to move without making a sound. She in turn began to emerge from her shell of silence. She started asking questions, her voice still quiet but growing stronger each day. She asked about the stars, about the animals they saw, about his life before Cedar Creek. One evening, as they huddled by a small smokeless fire, she asked about the locket. Who was Sarah? Silas looked into the flames, the memories rising like smoke. "She was my wife," he said, his voice thick with emotion. She saw the man I could be, not just the man I was. She made the world feel quiet. After she was gone, the world got loud again." He looked at Fern, her small face illuminated by the firelight. "Until you." Fern reached out and placed her small hand on his arm. "He has bad eyes," she said, her voice carrying the innocent but profound wisdom of a child. "The man in the black coat. Like a snake." "I know, little one," Silas said. "But we're not the mice he thinks we are." The chase came to a head near the abandoned mining outpost. They were crossing a wide, exposed plateau when Blackwood's party appeared on the horizon. There were 5 of them fanned out in a classic military formation. They had outmaneuvered him. "Run!" Silas yelled, giving Fern's horse a slap on the rump. "Get to the outpost. I'll hold them off." He dismounted, taking cover behind a cluster of boulders as rifle fire kicked up dust around him. He was 1 man against 5, impossible odds. But the Phantom of Gettysburg had faced impossible odds before. His specially modified rifle felt like an extension of his arm. He fired with methodical precision, not to kill, but to disable, to slow them down. He took out 2 of their horses with clean long-distance shots. But they were too good. They pinned him down, their crossfire a deadly web. A bullet ricocheted off the rock near his head, sending stone fragments into his cheek. He was trapped. Then, from the direction of the outpost, came the sound of another rifle, its report sharp and distinct. One of Blackwood's men cried out and fell from his saddle. It was Sheriff Garrett. The old lawman had followed them, a guardian angel in a dusty coat. The distraction was all Silas needed. He broke from his cover, running in a low crouch toward a deep arroyo that offered a path to the outpost. Bullets chewed the ground at his heels. He dove into the ditch just as a searing pain erupted in his side. He'd been hit. He stumbled into the ramshackle collection of buildings that was the outpost, his vision blurring. Fern ran to him, her face a mask of terror. "Papa, I'm all right," he grunted, pressing a hand to the wound. It was a deep graze, bleeding badly, but the bullet had passed through. Garrett joined them, his face grim. "They've got us boxed in," the sheriff said, peering out a grimy window. "Blackwood's too smart to charge in. He'll wait us out." The outpost consisted of a dilapidated saloon, an assay office, and a few small cabins. The telegraph office was at the far end of the dusty street. It might as well have been 100 miles away. As dusk fell, a sandstorm began to blow in from the west, the sky turning a sickly yellow-brown. The wind howled, rattling the loose boards of the saloon where they had taken shelter. "This is our chance," Silas said through gritted teeth, tearing a strip from his shirt to bandage his wound. "The storm will cover our movement." "What's the plan?" Garrett asked. "You give me covering fire. I'm going for the telegraph office." "You're wounded, Silas. You'll never make it." "I have to." He looked at Fern, who was watching him with wide, frightened eyes. "I made a promise." Suddenly, a voice carried on the wind, amplified by the strange acoustics of the storm. It was Blackwood. "Sergeant Stone. I know you're in there. I must say I'm disappointed. I expected a better fight from the hero of Little Round Top." The words hit Silas like a physical blow. Blackwood knew. "Come out, Sergeant," the voice taunted. "Let's finish what was started all those years ago. Or would you prefer to hide behind a child and an old man? The choice is yours." The time for running was over. The past had finally caught up to him. The final battle would not be fought over mineral claims or a murdered geologist. It would be fought here in the heart of a raging sandstorm between two soldiers who had unfinished business. The sandstorm descended upon the ghost town like a biblical plague. The wind shrieked a physical force that tore at the rotting wood of the buildings. Dust, thick as smoke, seeped through every crack, reducing visibility to mere feet and clogging the throat. Inside the Copper Dollar Saloon, the dim lantern light cast long, dancing shadows, turning the familiar space into a phantasmagoria of fear. The only steady sound was the ticking of a large clock on the wall, each second, a hammer blow marking the dwindling time. "He's baiting you," Silas Garrett said, his voice tight. He stood by the window rifle, ready, peering into the swirling brown chaos. "Don't let him get in your head." But he already was. Sergeant Stone. The name echoed in Silas's memory, dragging him back to a muddy, blood-soaked field in Virginia. To a decision made in the crucible of battle, a choice that had saved a regiment, but had cost him a piece of his soul. "I have to face him." Silas said, his voice a low growl of resolve. The pain in his side was a hot, insistent fire, but another older pain burned hotter. He looked at Fern, who was huddled near the cold hearth, her arms wrapped around her knees. The terror in her eyes was a mirror of his own guilt. "No," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the storm. "Don't go." He knelt beside her, his large scarred hand gently touching her cheek. "Sometimes, little one, you can't run from the ghosts. You have to turn and face them so they can't haunt anyone else." He pressed a small, heavy object into her hand. It was a deputy's badge Garrett had given him. "You're in charge of keeping the sheriff safe until I get back." "That's an order, deputy." He gave her a sad smile, then turned to Garrett. "The telegraph." "That's still the mission. When I draw their fire, you make a run for it. Send the message." "Silas, this is suicide," Garrett protested. "No," Silas said, checking the action on his Colt. "This is penance." He kicked open the saloon doors and stepped out into the storm. The wind tore at him, stinging his face with sand. "Blackwood!" He roared, his voice battling the gale. "You wanted the sergeant. You got him. A single shot rang out the muzzle flash, a brief angry star in the gloom. The bullet splintered the doorframe next to Silas's head. He didn't flinch. He walked slowly toward the center of the street, a giant moving through a maelstrom. Blackwood stepped out from behind the assay office, his black coat whipping in the wind. He held Sarah's locket in one hand, dangling it from its chain. "I knew you couldn't resist a grand gesture, Sergeant. Always the hero. My name is Silas Stone," he said, his voice cold and hard. "And you are going to give me back what is mine." Property, Blackwood laughed, a harsh grating sound. "Mr. Stone, a man of your stature should understand that possessions are fleeting. You of all people should know what it's like to have something taken from you." He took a step closer, the cruel wit in his eyes, visible even through the dust. "Do you remember Corporal Evans, Sergeant, a young man, with a wife and a baby on the way? A man you ordered to hold a position you knew was indefensible, just to buy your precious regiment a few more minutes." The memory hit Silas with the force of a cannonball. Corporal Evans, a good soldier, a brave man, a man Silas had sacrificed. "I remember him," Silas said, his voice hoarse. "Good," Blackwood snarled, the mask of the eloquent gentleman falling away to reveal the raw, festering wound beneath. "Because I remember you. I remember watching my entire squad get cut to pieces while you retreated to safety. I remember lying in the mud for 2 days, waiting to die with your name on my lips." He threw the locket to the ground. "You took my future on that battlefield, Sergeant. So I decided to take yours. First, the memory of your wife. And now," he nodded toward the saloon, "the child." The revelation reframed everything. The Carmichael's the mineral, claims the money. It was all a means to an end. Blackwood's true mission had always been personal, a meticulously planned revenge against the man he blamed for ruining his life. From the saloon, Garrett laid down a volley of covering fire, forcing Blackwood's men to take cover. Go Silas now. But Silas didn't move. This was his fight. He drew his Colt, the weight of it familiar and terrible in his hand. He could end this now. He could kill the man who had tormented him, who threatened the child he loved. The soldier in him, the phantom, screamed for vengeance. But as he looked at Blackwood, at Corporal Evans, he didn't just see a monster. He saw a broken man twisted by the same war that had shattered him. To kill him would be to become the man he was on that battlefield. To capture him, to bring him to justice. That would be the victory of the man he was trying to be. Silas Stone, the father. At that moment, a shot rang out from an unexpected quarter. One of Blackwood's men, hidden on a rooftop, had drawn a bead on Silas. But before he could fire, he was thrown back by a blast from Sheriff Garrett's shotgun. The lawman stood in the saloon doorway, smoke curling from his barrels. But his victory was short-lived. Another of Blackwood's men fired from the shadows, and Garrett crumpled to the ground, a dark stain spreading across his chest. Sheriff Fern screamed from inside. The sight of Garrett falling, of Fern's cry, broke the spell. Silas charged. He moved with a speed and ferocity that defied his size, a force of nature unleashed. He wasn't the phantom anymore. He was a father protecting his child. The fight was brutal and short. He closed the distance before Blackwood could react, his fist crashing into the other man's jaw. The fight devolved into a desperate close-quarter struggle in the blinding sand, two ghosts of the war trying to destroy each other. Silas was stronger, but Blackwood was fueled by years of hatred. He pulled a knife, slashing at Silas's wounded side. Pain exploded through Silas's body, but he fought through it, his hands finding Blackwood's throat. He could squeeze, he could end it. He saw Sarah's face in his mind, then Fern's. He remembered his promise. With a final agonized roar, he slammed Blackwood's head against the corner of a horse trough, and the man went limp. Silas stood over his defeated enemy, panting, bleeding, but victorious. He had faced his ghost and won not by killing, but by choosing justice. He scooped Sarah's locket from the dust and stumbled toward the saloon. He found Fern kneeling beside Sheriff Garrett. The old lawman was pale, his breathing shallow. "He saved me," Fern whispered, tears streaming down her face. Garrett looked up at Silas, a faint, bloody smile on his lips. "Told you?" The badge had to mean something. He pressed the telegraph key, which he had dragged with him, into Silas's hand. "Go. Finish it." Leaving Fern to comfort the dying sheriff, Silas staggered through the storm to the telegraph office. The line was miraculously intact. His fingers, clumsy with pain and emotion, tapped out the message. "Marshal's office, Prescott. Conspiracy to commit murder. Thomas Morrison. Carmichael family of Philadelphia prime suspects. Witness is Morrison's daughter, Fern. Location." He transmitted their coordinates, along with Blackwood's real name, and a full confession of the plot as he now understood it. As he sent the last word, the strength finally left him, and he collapsed to the floor, the locket clutched tight in his hand, and the storm outside beginning finally to subside. The aftermath was quiet, as peace always is after a storm. A territorial marshal's posse, guided by Silas's telegram, arrived 2 days later to find a scene of grim resolution. They found Blackwood and his surviving men tied up a dying sheriff, who gave a full deathbed statement, and a giant of a man being tended to by a slip of a girl who showed a courage far beyond her years. The full weight of the law, once it was pointed in the right direction, was swift and unyielding. The Carmichael empire, built on a foundation of lies and murder, crumbled under federal investigation. Fern Morrison's testimony was the keystone that brought the whole corrupt structure down. Blackwood, or Corporal Evans, as he was now known, was sentenced to life in prison, left to confront the ghosts of his own making in a cold stone cell. Silas recovered slowly, his physical wounds healing far faster than the ones on his soul. He had faced his past and survived, but the cost had been high. Sheriff Garrett was buried in Cedar Creek's small cemetery, his simple wooden marker bearing the inscription, "A man who made his badge mean something." The whole town turned out their shame at having been swayed by Harlow's money, replaced by a deep respect for the men who had fought for the truth. Months passed. The autumn chill gave way to the quiet blanket of winter, and then to the tentative promise of spring. Cedar Creek began to heal. With the legal matters settled, a trust was established for Fern, managing the immense wealth of her father's discovery. She would never want for anything material. But Silas knew that wasn't what mattered. He officially adopted her, the legal papers a mere formality for a bond forged in fire and loyalty. They stayed in the small cabin at the edge of town, and their quiet life resumed, but forever changed. Fern began to smile more, her laughter a sound that Silas came to cherish more than his own heartbeat. She started attending the small-town school, her quick mind soaking up knowledge with a fierce hunger. One clear spring afternoon, when the wildflowers were blanketing the canyon walls in a riot of color, Silas knew it was time. He took Fern by the hand, and they walked to the cemetery. They stopped first at Sheriff Garrett's grave, laying a small bouquet of Indian paintbrush on the mound of earth. Then they walked to a small windswept plot at the edge of the grounds, marked by a simple headstone Silas had carved himself years ago. "Sarah Stone, beloved wife. Until we meet again." He knelt, his large frame casting a long shadow over the grave. With trembling fingers, he took out the locket. It was scratched and dented from its ordeal, but the silver still shone, and the engraving of Sarah's name was still clear. He opened it, looked at the smiling face of the woman he had loved, and then he gently placed it on the headstone. He was letting her go, not from his heart, but from the prison of his grief. Fern, who had been standing silently beside him, stepped forward. She held out a single perfect bluebell she had picked on their walk. She laid it carefully on the ground next to the locket. Silas took a deep breath of the clean spring air filling his lungs. He looked at the grave, then at the child beside him. He put his arm around her small shoulders. "Sarah." He said, his voice quiet and steady, a one-sided conversation with the past. "This is Fern. She's my daughter." He squeezed Fern's shoulder gently, a bridge forming between the ghost he had finally laid to rest and the future that stood living and breathing beside him. "We're going to be all right." The past and the present united under the vast western sky. He had lost his family once, but in the heart of the wilderness, amidst violence and loss, he had found it again. He had made peace with the phantom, and in his place, a father stood tall.